I woke up in the middle of the night to see someone standing at the foot of my bed. It was my nephew, holding a notebook. What he said next turned my world upside down. "I couldn't find this anywhere else," he muttered, but his eyes told a different story. In that silent moment, a connection sparked that I couldn't ignore, and I knew life would never be the same again. My name is Anna, and I'm a 36-year-old woman who once thought I had everything figured out. My husband, Eric, and I had built a stable life together. He worked tirelessly as a project manager, often leaving early in the morning and returning late at night, or sometimes not at all. Our home had become quiet, a stark contrast to the vibrant relationship we once shared. We were the couple everyone envied, partners who could tackle anything together. But over time, our connection had dulled, buried beneath the demands of his career and the monotony of daily life. Eric's absence left a void, a silence that grew louder with every passing day. I found myself craving even the smallest sign of affection, but instead, I was met with empty spaces and unspoken words. One evening, I was particularly drained, overwhelmed by the loneliness that had taken root in my life. As I lay in bed, hoping for sleep to offer some escape, I drifted off into a rare moment of peace. Then, I was startled awake by a soft sound. Opening my eyes, I saw my nephew, Jason, standing at the edge of my bed. His face was a mix of anxiety and hesitation as he clutched a notebook. "I'm so sorry, Aunt Anna," he said in a quiet voice. "I need this for a university assignment, and I couldn't find it anywhere else." Jason had always been considerate, the kind of young man who carried himself with quiet maturity. Seeing him there, out of place in the middle of the night, was surprising, but not unsettling. I sat up, adjusted my nightgown, and smiled gently to reassure him. "It's all right, Jason. Why don't you sit down for a moment?" Reluctantly, he perched on the chair by my bed. What started as an awkward moment turned into a heartfelt conversation. He opened up about his final year of university, the pressures of exams, late nights of studying, and the uncertainty of the future. I found myself captivated by the depth of his words, the way he expressed himself with such thoughtfulness and sincerity. That night, I saw Jason in a new light, not just as my nephew, but as a kind and empathetic soul. And for the first time in months, I felt understood. In the days that followed, Jason's presence became a comforting constant in my life. With Eric working late and my days growing lonelier, Jason and I naturally found more time to talk. What began as casual chats turned into deeper, more meaningful conversations that left me feeling something I hadn't felt in years: a sense of connection. Jason started joining me in the kitchen to help prepare dinner, or sitting with me on the porch as the sun set, sharing his thoughts about his future and his dreams. His insight and emotional depth surprised me every time. But amidst the warmth of our growing bond, there were moments that gave me pause, fleeting exchanges that felt like more than they should. One afternoon, as we were organizing books on the living room shelf, Jason brushed his hand against mine while reaching for the same book. It was an innocent touch, but it lingered just a second too long. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly pulled away, pretending not to notice. But in that moment, I felt a strange tension, one that I couldn't quite name. Then there were his glances, those fleeting moments when I caught him looking at me in a way that made my cheeks flush. It wasn't just admiration or fondness, there was something deeper, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I told myself I was imagining things, blaming my own loneliness for the strange feelings creeping into my heart. After all, this was Jason, my nephew, a bond that should remain pure and untouchable. But the cracks in my rationalizations grew larger one evening when we sat in the garden. I had been feeling particularly low, the emptiness of my marriage weighing heavily on me. Jason noticed and asked softly, "Are you okay, Aunt Anna?" His concern felt genuine, and I opened up in a way I hadn't with anyone, not even Eric. I confessed how Eric's work had left me feeling invisible, like a shadow in my own home. Jason listened intently, his gaze unwavering. His empathy was overwhelming, and when he spoke, his words pierced through my defenses. "You deserve to feel seen, Anna," he said gently. "You give so much to others. Maybe it's time someone gave back to you." His sincerity made my heart ache. It was a simple statement, but it resonated deeply. I tried to dismiss the warmth that spread through me, but it was becoming harder to ignore. I felt myself wanting to be near him, craving the understanding and companionship he offered. The turning point came late one evening after another long conversation. As I stood up to head to bed, Jason reached out, his hand brushing my arm. "Good night, Anna," he said, his voice quiet but layered with something unspoken. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to still. There was something in his gaze, an intensity, a question, that left me breathless. I walked away quickly, retreating to the safety of my room. But as I lay in bed, the moment replayed in my mind. I knew I should have been horrified by what I was feeling, but instead, I felt a thrill that terrified me. I began noticing the small ways I was changing. How I dressed a little more carefully when I knew Jason would be around, how I lingered in his company longer than I should. I told myself it was innocent, that I was simply enjoying the company of someone who cared. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The tension between us was undeniable, and each passing day made it harder to pretend otherwise. As the weeks went by, the connection between Jason and me grew deeper, more complicated. What once felt like innocent companionship now carried a charge that neither of us could ignore. It was as if every conversation, every shared laugh, was laced with something unspoken, something simmering just below the surface. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the air between us felt heavier than usual. Jason was telling me about a book he'd been reading for his coursework, but I struggled to focus. I was too aware of how close he was sitting, of the warmth radiating from him. Then he paused mid-sentence and looked at me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. "Aunt Anna," he said softly, "do you ever think about what makes you happy? I mean really happy?" The question caught me off guard. I stammered out an answer about being content with my life, but even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't true. Jason seemed to sense my hesitation. His gaze didn't waver, and in that moment, it felt as though he could see right through me. "You deserve to be happy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't ever forget that." His words lingered in the air long after he'd left the room, leaving me restless and unsettled. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he listened, the way he looked at me, it was unlike anything I'd experienced in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. And that feeling was intoxicating. The shift between us became undeniable during one late-night conversation. We were sitting in the garden, the warm glow of the porch light casting soft shadows on his face. Our usual light-hearted banter had given way to something more personal, more vulnerable. Jason asked me about my dreams, the ones I'd had before marrying Eric, before life had become a series of routines. I opened up in a way I hadn't with anyone, sharing how I'd once dreamed of becoming a writer, how I'd imagined a life full of creativity and passion. As I spoke, Jason listened with an intensity that made my heart race. "You should do it," he said firmly. "You're too talented to let those dreams slip away." The way he said it with such conviction made my chest tighten. I could feel tears welling up, but I quickly blinked them away. Before I could respond, Jason reached out and placed his hand over mine. It was a small gesture, but it sent a shockwave through me. His touch was warm, steady, and full of unspoken meaning. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Instead, I met his gaze, and in that moment something shifted. The boundaries we'd both been clinging to seemed to dissolve. Jason leaned closer, his face inches from mine, and for a fleeting moment, I thought he might kiss me. My breath hitched, and my heart pounded in my chest. But then he hesitated, pulling back with a conflicted look in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. "I didn't mean to." "No," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "It's okay." The words hung between us, filled with an unspoken acknowledgement of what we both knew but hadn't dared to say. That night, after Jason left, I couldn't stop thinking about the moment we'd shared. I told myself it was just a fleeting lapse in judgment, a result of my loneliness. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The next time we saw each other, the tension was palpable. Jason had come over to help me fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen, but the air between us crackled with unspoken energy. As he worked, I found myself watching him, noticing the way his hands moved, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. I knew I shouldn't be looking at him that way, but I couldn't help myself. At one point, he turned to me, catching me staring. His lips curved into a faint smile, and I felt my cheeks flush. "What?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. "Nothing," I said quickly, looking away. But the moment hung between us, heavy with possibilities. Later that evening, as we sat on the couch, the inevitable finally happened. Jason turned to me, his expression earnest and vulnerable. "Anna," he said softly, "I don't know how to say this, but I can't stop thinking about you." His confession hit me like a tidal wave. Every rational thought screamed at me to stop, to set boundaries, to remember who we were to each other. But my heart overpowered my mind. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us, and before I could think twice, our lips met. The kiss was hesitant at first, filled with uncertainty and fear. But as the seconds passed, it deepened, becoming more intense, more urgent. It was as if all the emotions we'd been holding back came rushing to the surface, unstoppable and undeniable. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we'd done settled over us like a heavy cloud. But in that moment, I didn't care about the consequences. All I could think about was how right it had felt, how alive I felt for the first time in years. It all came crashing down one fateful evening when the world we had carefully constructed around us began to unravel. Jason and I had grown bolder in the weeks that followed our first kiss. We found ourselves stealing moments whenever we could, pushing the boundaries further each time. The thrill of secrecy, the magnetic pull between us, it had become something neither of us could resist. But deep down, I always knew it was a matter of time before the truth would catch up with us. That evening, Eric returned home earlier than expected. I hadn't even heard the front door open, too caught up in the warmth of Jason's presence. We were in the living room, sitting too close, lost in a quiet conversation that had become our nightly ritual. Jason's hand was resting on mine, a gesture that had become far too familiar. His touch felt safe, comforting, but also dangerous. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jason murmured, his voice low and intimate. "About following your dreams. I think you should write, Anna. You have so much to share." I smiled at his encouragement, my heart swelling with emotions I couldn't name. But before I could respond, the sound of Eric clearing his throat shattered the moment. We both froze, the blood draining from my face as I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Am I interrupting something?" Eric's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent chills down my spine. I pulled my hand away from Jason's as if it had burned me. "Eric, you're home early," I stammered, my mind racing for an explanation, a way to defuse the situation. Jason stood abruptly, his face pale. "Uncle Eric, I was just helping Anna with, something for the house." Eric's eyes darted between us, his jaw tightening. "Helping her? It looks more like you two were getting cozy." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My stomach churned, and I struggled to find the words to explain, to deny what he had clearly seen. But the weight of guilt was too much. My silence spoke louder than any words could. "I think I should go," Jason said, his voice shaky. He avoided Eric's gaze as he grabbed his backpack and hurried out of the room. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Eric and me alone in a silence so thick it felt impossible to breathe. Eric turned to me, his expression dark and unreadable. "What the hell is going on, Anna?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My mind was a whirlwind of fear, shame, and panic. How could I explain what had happened? How could I justify the feelings I couldn't even fully understand myself? "Eric, it's not what you think," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then what is it?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife and my nephew are involved." His words cut through me like a knife, the weight of the truth crashing down around us. Tears welled in my eyes, and I shook my head, desperate to deny it, to make it go away. But the look on Eric's face told me it was too late. He had seen enough, pieced together enough to know that something was deeply wrong. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, my voice breaking. "It wasn't planned. I never wanted to hurt you." Eric let out a bitter laugh, his expression hardening. "Hurt me? Anna, you've destroyed everything." The argument that followed was a blur, a torrent of accusations, tears, and broken confessions. I told him the truth about my loneliness, about how distant he had become, about how Jason had filled a void I hadn't even realized was there. But my words only seemed to fuel his anger. "And that's supposed to make it okay," he shouted. "Because I was busy working, you decided to betray me with Jason? My nephew." I had no defense. Everything he said was true, and the weight of my guilt was crushing. Eric paced the room, running his hands through his hair as he tried to process what I had told him. Finally, he stopped and looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and disgust. "I can't do this, Anna," he said quietly. "I can't look at you right now." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Moments later, I heard the sound of his car starting, and then he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face as the reality of what I had done settled over me. My marriage was in ruins, and the life I had built with Eric had crumbled in a matter of moments. But even amidst the devastation, I couldn't stop thinking about Jason. I wanted to reach out to him, to explain, to make sure he was okay. But I knew it wasn't the right time. Eric's discovery had shattered everything, and the consequences of our actions were only just beginning to unfold. The next few days were a blur of regret and uncertainty. Eric refused to answer my calls, and Jason kept his distance, likely grappling with his own guilt. I was left alone in the wreckage, trying to make sense of what had happened and where to go from here. But one thing was clear. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. In the days following Eric's departure, my home became a hollow, echoing shell of what it once was. The life I had built with him was gone, and all that remained was the weight of my guilt and the shattered remnants of our relationship. Each room seemed to hold a memory of the past, a reminder of the love and trust one had betrayed. Eric had cut off all contact. I left message after message, hoping he might at least give me a chance to explain, to apologize, to plead for forgiveness. But his silence was absolute, and each unanswered call drove home the reality that I had lost him. Jason, too, had distanced himself. For days, I didn't hear a word from him, and the absence of his presence was almost unbearable. I found myself replaying the last moments we'd shared, the tension in his voice, the panic in his eyes as he left that night. I wanted to believe he was okay, that he was simply giving us both space to process what had happened. But deep down, I knew he was struggling just as much as I was. The isolation was suffocating. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Eric's face, the anger and hurt etched into his features. And then there was Jason, the softness in his gaze, the warmth of his touch, the intensity of the connection we had shared. My heart ached for both of them in different ways, torn between the devastation of my marriage and the undeniable bond one had found with Jason. One evening, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jason. My heart raced as I opened it, a mix of relief and apprehension flooding through me. "I'm sorry for everything," the message read. "I didn't mean for things to get this far. I never wanted to hurt you, or Uncle Eric. But I don't know how to fix this." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel the pain in every syllable, the weight of his guilt mirroring my own. I wanted to reply, to tell him that he wasn't alone in this, that I didn't regret the moments we had shared despite everything. But as I stared at the screen, I realized I didn't have the words. How could I offer him comfort when I couldn't even make sense of my own emotions? The next time we saw each other, it was as if an invisible wall had been erected between us. Jason came to the house to pick up some belongings he had left behind, and the awkward tension was almost unbearable. We avoided eye contact, our words clipped and careful. But just as he was about to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Anna," he said softly, turning back to face me. "I don't know what happens next. I hope you're okay." His vulnerability was heartbreaking, and I felt tears welling up as I nodded. "I'm trying," I replied. "And I hope you're okay too." After he left, I sank onto the couch, overwhelmed by the reality of what our actions had cost us. Jason had been my solace, my refuge in a time of loneliness and despair. But now that connection felt like a burden, a painful reminder of the choices I had made and the consequences I could no longer escape. As the weeks passed, the fallout from Eric's discovery began to ripple through our lives in ways I hadn't anticipated. Word spread among our family, whispers turning into full-blown rumors. Eric's side of the family was quick to rally behind him, their judgment of me harsh and unforgiving. I became the villain of the story, the wife who had betrayed her husband with his own nephew. And while I knew I deserved their anger, the weight of their scorn was almost too much to bear. Jason, too, bore the brunt of the fallout. His relationship with Eric was irreparably damaged, and he found himself ostracized by some of our relatives. His once bright future now seemed clouded by the stigma of our actions, and the guilt of knowing I had played a part in that weighed heavily on me. But amidst the chaos and heartbreak, I began to confront the deeper truths about myself and the choices that had led me to this point. I realized that my loneliness, my yearning for connection, had blinded me to the consequences of my actions. I had sought solace in Jason, not fully understanding the impact it would have on everyone around us. And while our bond had been real, it had also been built on a foundation of pain and betrayal. One evening, as I stood in the quiet of my kitchen, I made a decision. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could try to move forward. I began seeking therapy, hoping to understand the deeper issues that had led me down this path. I needed to face my own flaws, to confront the loneliness and dissatisfaction that had driven me to make such devastating choices. And while the road ahead felt uncertain and daunting, I knew it was the only way to begin picking up the pieces of my life. The weeks turned into months, and while the storm of my actions had not fully passed, I began to find moments of clarity amid the wreckage. Therapy became my lifeline, a space where I could unpack the pain, loneliness, and mistakes that had led me to this point. My therapist helped me see the patterns I had fallen into, the way I had let my needs and desires fade into the background of my marriage, the way I had sought validation and connection in all the wrong places. One of the hardest things to accept was the simple truth that I had been complicit in my own unhappiness. Eric had been distant, yes, but I had never told him just how much his absence hurt me. I had allowed the silence between us to grow until it was deafening, and instead of confronting it, I had sought solace in someone else. That realization was sobering, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. If I was going to move forward, I needed to take responsibility for my own healing. Eric, meanwhile, had not returned. He filed for divorce quietly, without confrontation, and the finality of it left me hollow. When the papers arrived, I cried for hours, not just for the end of our marriage, but for the life we had once dreamed of building together. Signing those papers felt like letting go of a part of myself, and yet I knew it was necessary. Eric deserved peace, and so did I. Jason remained a complicated presence in my life. After that final conversation at my door, we didn't speak for weeks. I respected his need for distance, knowing he was grappling with his own guilt and confusion. But one day, out of the blue, he reached out. His message was brief but heartfelt. "I hope you're doing okay. I'm trying to figure things out too." We met for coffee not long after. It was a cautious reunion, marked by tentative words and long silences. Jason told me he had started seeing a counselor as well, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He admitted he felt lost, uncertain of how to rebuild his relationship with his family, or if that was even possible. "I don't regret the connection we had," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. "But I do regret how it all happened." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "Me too," I replied. "I cared about you, still do, but we both deserved better than what we became." That conversation marked a turning point for both of us. We agreed to focus on healing separately, recognizing that whatever we had shared, it was rooted in pain and would only bring more harm if we tried to hold on to it. Saying goodbye to Jason was bittersweet, but it was also necessary. For the first time, I felt like I was making the right choice, for myself, for him, and for everyone we had hurt. As I moved forward, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. I picked up my old journals and started writing again, rediscovering the passion I had long buried beneath the weight of routine. Writing became my outlet, a way to process my emotions and make sense of the chaos. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again. Not the wife who had been left behind, not the woman consumed by guilt, but someone stronger, someone who had learned from her mistakes. The lessons from this chapter of my life were painful but invaluable. I learned that silence in a relationship can be as destructive as words, that unspoken needs and unresolved hurts will eventually find their way to the surface. I learned that seeking comfort in forbidden places only leads to more pain, for yourself and for everyone around you. But most importantly, I learned that healing is possible, even when it feels impossible to move forward. As I look back now, I don't see myself as the villain or the victim of my story. I see someone who made mistakes, who let loneliness and desperation cloud her judgment, but who also found the strength to face the consequences and begin again. Life is messy and love is complicated, but I believe we're all capable of growth if we're willing to do the hard work. For anyone reading or hearing this, I leave you with this. Cherish the connections you have, but never lose sight of yourself in the process. Speak your truths, even when they're uncomfortable. And if you find yourself lost, know that it's never too late to find your way back. If you were in Anna's shoes, what would you have done differently? Do you think healing is possible after such betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that explore the complex sides of love, relationships, and self-discovery. Stay tuned for the next story. You won't want to miss what's coming next.